The nurse smiled and said, "This will sting a little, unless you like it." And just like that, my world tilted. The day began like any other, but as I walked into the clinic, a quiet tension settled in my chest, a mix of nerves and anticipation that I couldn't quite explain. The antiseptic scent clung to the air, crisp and clinical, yet beneath it lingered a faint, subtle hint of perfume, delicate and reassuring, that immediately drew my attention. I scanned the room and noticed her almost at once, the nurse, a woman in her early 40s, moving with a grace that seemed effortless, yet entirely composed. There was an understated confidence in her posture, the kind that made people instinctively feel safe, though at the same time, it drew the eye in a way I hadn't anticipated. She approached with a clipboard, her eyes bright behind subtle glasses, and offered a warm smile that contrasted sharply with the sterile surroundings. "This will sting a little, unless you like it," she said, her tone light, teasing, almost mischievous, as if she knew exactly the effect her words might have. I blinked, caught off guard by the playful edge, and felt my pulse skip, not just from the thought of the procedure, but from the subtle thrill of her presence. Her movements were calm and deliberate. As she handed me the forms, her fingers brushed mine briefly, an almost accidental touch that lingered just long enough for me to notice the warmth of her skin. I felt a curious mixture of comfort and awareness. There was something magnetic about her, a quiet energy that drew me in while keeping a boundary I didn't want to cross too soon. Even the way she spoke, the soft inflection in her voice, the careful pauses as she gave instructions, made my thoughts slow down, forcing me to take notice of every little detail. I sat down in the waiting area, my eyes occasionally drifting back toward her as she moved between patients. There was a quiet rhythm to her day, punctuated by the faint rustle of paper and the muted hum of equipment, yet she carried herself as if she were aware of something beyond the routine, a gentle awareness that made the air between us feel charged, even in its silence. Every small gesture, the tilt of her head when listening, the easy way she laughed at a patient's joke, impressed upon me a subtle, unspoken connection. By the time my name was called, I was already acutely aware of her presence, the faint warmth of her touch lingering in my mind. She guided me toward the procedure with a composed, reassuring ease, yet there was a softness in her gaze that hinted at something unspoken. In that moment, my nerves and curiosity intertwined. I knew that leaving the clinic that day would not be the end of our story, and that one playful line, "Unless you like it," had quietly shifted the entire course of my thoughts. The next time I saw her, the memory of her playful words lingered like a quiet echo in my mind. I wasn't sure if it was the lingering nervous energy of the last visit or something deeper, but seeing her again felt like stepping into a warm, familiar space I hadn't realized I craved. She noticed me first, her eyes lighting up with a subtle spark, like she recognized the same curiosity and attentiveness in me that I had felt in her. There was a brief pause, a small acknowledgement that seemed to suspend time, before she returned to her work, moving with that same effortless grace that had first captivated me. Our conversation began lightly, almost innocuously. She asked questions about my comfort and routine with gentle curiosity, teasing me about being meticulously careful with forms and forms alone. Each word, each glance, carried an undertone of something unspoken, a subtle intimacy that I was not prepared for. When she adjusted my sleeve to check my arm, her fingers brushed mine, a fleeting touch that left a warmth lingering in my skin. It was accidental, I told myself, yet my chest tightened in a way that suggested otherwise. Her touch had a quiet steadiness, a grounding presence that somehow made the sterile clinic air feel softer, warmer. The small gestures became moments I couldn't help but notice. When she leaned over slightly to explain a procedure, the scent of her perfume mingled with the antiseptic, creating an unexpectedly comforting mix. The brush of her hair against my shoulder as she moved past me, the faint laughter that escaped when a patient cracked a joke, all of it imprinted itself in my mind, a sensory map of her presence. I realized I was paying attention to details I normally wouldn't, the curve of her smile, the gentle cadence of her voice, the way her eyes crinkled ever so slightly when she was amused. When our brief interaction ended, she offered a soft nod and a small, knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement that the tension and curiosity between us were mutual, even if unspoken. Walking away, I felt that familiar flutter, that strange combination of comfort and awareness that made me acutely conscious of every step. My thoughts lingered on her touch, her smile, and the quiet confidence she exuded. There was something undeniably magnetic about her, and yet entirely approachable, a delicate balance I couldn't reconcile in my mind. By the time I left the clinic, I realized I wasn't just thinking about the procedure or even the playful sting she'd promised. I was thinking about her, the way she had quietly drawn me into her orbit with casual gestures and a warmth that felt almost intentional. That day, I left with a subtle, but undeniable sense that this connection, unexpected as it was only beginning to unfold. When I returned from my follow-up visit, I felt a quiet, anticipatory flutter in my chest, the kind that made my normally measured steps hesitate in the hallway. The clinic seemed smaller somehow, more intimate, as if her presence had subtly altered the space around me. And there she was, exactly where I expected, yet completely captivating, moving through the room with her characteristic ease. Her hair was pinned back differently today, a few soft strands escaping that framed her face in a way that made her expressions all the more striking. She looked up and caught my eyes, a fleeting smile curling her lips, and I felt the familiar tug of curiosity, coupled with a surprising warmth that seemed to seep into my very bones. As we began the routine check, small gestures became monumental. She handed me a warm cloth to clean my hands before the procedure, her fingers grazing mine, brief, almost accidental, but enough to leave a subtle heat where our skin met. My mind lingered on that touch longer than it should have, and I found myself noticing details I hadn't before, the gentle steadiness of her wrist, the natural confidence in her movements, the faint pulse I could feel when her hand rested against my arm for a moment. These weren't just touches, they were anchors of presence, drawing me into a quiet intimacy I wasn't fully prepared to name. The clinic sound seemed to fade into the background, the faint rustle of paper, the distant murmur of another patient, the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. In that hushed rhythm, our closeness became magnified. Every glance she cast, every brief pause in her speech, felt deliberate in a way that pulled my attention entirely toward her. There was a subtle tension in our proximity, a quiet awareness that neither of us needed to verbalize, but both of us felt. Her eyes held a softness that contrasted with the playful spark I remembered, as if she were inviting me to linger just a little longer, to notice her as she noticed me. By the time the procedure concluded, a small, shared smile passed between us, a silent acknowledgement that this unspoken curiosity was mutual. I left the clinic with a heightened awareness of every sensation, the warmth left behind by her touch, the echo of her laughter in my mind, the gentle way she had made me feel seen without effort. That day, I realized that it wasn't just a fleeting interest or superficial attraction, it was a growing awareness of her presence, an unspoken connection that lingered long after the room fell away. As I walked out, I couldn't shake the thought that this curiosity, this quiet, persistent pull, was the beginning of something I didn't fully understand yet. And somehow, I hoped she felt it too. The follow-up visit brought more than routine procedures, it brought an unexpected depth. As I sat across from her, I felt a strange mix of nerves and trust, as if the subtle connection we'd begun to form had created an invisible bridge between us. Today, something compelled me to speak more freely than usual, words spilling out about a concern I usually kept to myself, something personal that made my chest tighten just thinking about it. Her reaction was immediate but gentle, she didn't rush to dismiss my feelings, didn't offer clichés. Instead, she listened, really listened, with an attentiveness that made the sterile room feel warmer, more intimate. Her presence carried a quiet reassurance. The faint brush of her hand against my shoulder when guiding me through a movement was grounding, yet electric in a subtle way. The warmth of her skin, the steady pressure of her palm, made me acutely aware of her proximity. It wasn't flirtation, it was the kind of touch that communicates empathy without words, the kind that says, "I see you, and you are not alone." My heartbeat seemed to synchronize with the calm rhythm of her presence, and for a moment, the anxious tension I had felt since entering the clinic dissipated entirely. As we talked, I noticed the softness in her eyes, the slight crinkle when she smiled, the gentle tilt of her head when she leaned in to understand better. Each detail was etched into my mind, the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the antiseptic air, the faint sound of her breath as she spoke quietly, the slow, deliberate way her fingers adjusted the paperwork between us. I felt exposed and safe at the same time, a paradox that made the space between us feel electric yet comforting. Her vulnerability surprised me. In a rare quiet moment, she shared a small, personal anecdote about her own life, a glimpse into experiences that had shaped her calm confidence. The story wasn't dramatic, but it carried honesty, a glimpse behind the composed exterior that only someone truly observant would notice. Hearing her speak in that way made the connection between us feel more substantial, more real. It wasn't just curiosity anymore, it was the start of something deeper, a recognition that we could hold space for each other's insecurities and still feel a quiet joy in one another's presence. When our interaction ended, the lingering warmth of her touch on my shoulder remained, as if imprinting itself on my mind. Walking out, I realized that this subtle, shared vulnerability had quietly shifted the dynamic between us. What had started as playful curiosity had grown into a soft, mutual trust, an unspoken promise that, perhaps, our connection was meant to evolve beyond the routine of a clinic visit. And in that thought, I felt a tentative excitement, tempered with respect and anticipation for what was yet to unfold. After several visits, the connection between us had grown undeniable, though unspoken. Each encounter carried a weight of anticipation, a quiet tension that seemed to linger in the air long after the routine checkups ended. I noticed the subtle shift in our interactions, the way her smile held a little more warmth, the way our hands brushed a fraction longer than necessary when she adjusted my sleeves or guided me through a procedure. Each touch was fleeting, almost accidental, yet it left a lingering heat and a sense of closeness that I could neither ignore nor fully understand. In my own mind, hesitation tangled with desire. There was an internal struggle I couldn't dismiss, the awareness of the age difference, the boundaries of propriety, the fear of misreading signals. Yet, the pull toward her was magnetic. Even in the sterile environment of the clinic, the air seemed charged, as though the room itself had softened, permitting a quiet intimacy that neither of us dared name aloud. Her presence had become a paradox, calming and exhilarating at once. When she leaned over to adjust my posture, the faint scent of her perfume mingled with the antiseptic air, filling my senses in a way that made my pulse quicken. The brush of her fingertips across my arm, light and deliberate, sent an electric current through the subtle tension between us. Every glance felt weighted with unspoken questions, every pause stretched in anticipation. I realized I was acutely aware of her every movement, the tilt of her head, the gentle inflection of her voice, the soft rustle of her uniform. And yet, we both hesitated. There was a mutual awareness that the attraction simmering beneath the surface needed care, needed patience. It wasn't impulsive longing, it was slow-burning curiosity, a desire tempered by respect and emotional intelligence. I caught myself imagining moments beyond the clinic, the warmth of her hand in mine during a casual conversation, the softness of her shoulder brushing against mine as we laughed together. Each thought was accompanied by a flurry of both excitement and uncertainty, a delicate push and pull that left me restless yet eager. By the time our session ended, we shared a lingering look, long enough to communicate curiosity and desire, yet brief enough to maintain the quiet propriety between us. As I walked out, my chest still tight with the tension of unspoken words, I understood something crucial: this attraction wasn't a fleeting spark. It was a slow, deliberate ignition, one that demanded patience, awareness, and emotional honesty. And somehow, I knew that the hesitation, the careful pacing, would only make the eventual connection between us more profound, more meaningful, and unforgettable. The next visit carried a weight I hadn't expected, a quiet anticipation that settled in my chest before I even entered the clinic. It wasn't nerves this time, it was something deeper, a steady awareness that the moments we shared had begun to mean more than casual curiosity. She was there, moving through the room with her usual grace, yet I noticed small changes, the softness in her gaze when she met my eyes, the faint smile that lingered just a fraction longer than before. There was an unspoken understanding, a subtle acknowledgement of the growing connection between us. As the routine check began, the gestures that had once seemed incidental now felt charged with meaning. When she adjusted my sleeve, her fingers brushed against my forearm, lingering just slightly, and I felt a warmth that seemed to radiate through me. The pulse of her hand, the quiet steadiness of her touch, and the way she met my gaze made the sterile room feel suddenly intimate. The humming of the fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of another patient, they all faded into the background, leaving only the quiet rhythm of our shared space. Something compelled me to speak honestly, to admit what had been building quietly in my chest. I spoke softly, my words hesitant at first, revealing the subtle pull I felt toward her, the curiosity that had grown into admiration and something tenderly akin to desire. Her reaction was immediate yet gentle. She didn't dismiss my confession with jokes or embarrassment. Instead, her expression softened, and a quiet warmth spread across her features. There was a brief pause, a moment suspended in time, where our mutual acknowledgement filled the space between us without the need for words. Then came her gesture, a small, deliberate touch as she brushed a stray strand of hair from my forehead. Her fingers lingered just long enough to let me feel the pulse beneath her skin, a steady heartbeat that mirrored the quiet intensity of my own. In that moment, all hesitation dissolved, replaced by a profound sense of connection. It wasn't impulsive or overwhelming, it was calm, intentional, and deeply intimate. The air between us seemed to hum with understanding, a subtle acknowledgement that our feelings were aligned, that this bond was not one-sided. As our interaction ended, we shared a final, lingering glance. It was more than a look, it was a promise of mutual curiosity, respect, and a connection that had slowly, deliberately taken root. Walking out of the clinic, I felt a warmth in my chest that wasn't fleeting excitement, it was the quiet satisfaction of finally having the unspoken mirrored, of having our emotions acknowledged without rush or expectation. That day, I understood that what we were building was real, meaningful, and destined to unfold naturally, in its own patient, deliberate rhythm. In the days following our quiet confession, something shifted. The connection that had been building slowly, almost imperceptibly, now had space to breathe, to grow, outside the confines of the clinic. Our encounters became less formal, more personal, coffee meetups after appointments, casual conversations that stretched longer than necessary, lingering in parks or quiet corners of cafes where time seemed to soften and stretch. Each interaction was a new layer, revealing depth, warmth, and the delicate complexity of someone you were beginning to care for deeply. The small gestures that had once been fleeting now carried intent and comfort. Her hand brushing against mine as we laughed over a shared story, the gentle leaning toward each other to hear over background noise, the subtle way she rested her shoulder against mine while walking, every movement was a conversation of its own, rich with unspoken understanding. These touches weren't loud or demanding, they were tender, deliberate, each one building trust, intimacy, and a quiet joy that didn't need words. There were moments when our gazes held longer than they should have, and a silence would settle, not awkward, but soft and alive, filled with possibility. I noticed every nuance, the subtle crinkle near her eyes when she smiled, the soft cadence of her laughter, the warmth of her presence that seemed to seep into me with each passing moment. And in those moments, I realized how deeply I had come to care for her, not merely for the playful spark of our first encounter, but for the person she was, for her kindness, her strength, and the quiet vulnerability she allowed me to witness. We explored our connection gently, without haste. The age gap that might have felt daunting in theory faded in practice, replaced by mutual respect, understanding, and the shared experience of two lives quietly intertwining. Conversations turned to shared stories of past regrets, future hopes, and small, daily joys, each revelation drawing us closer, deepening the emotional intimacy that had been carefully cultivated over time. The story found its culmination not in dramatic declarations, but in subtle, heartfelt acknowledgement. One evening, as we sat side by side on a park bench, her hand found mine, fingers interlacing naturally. The warmth of her touch, steady and reassuring, anchored me in a profound sense of belonging. I could feel her heartbeat against mine, gentle and unhurried, a quiet echo of the trust and affection that had grown between us. As we leaned into that shared stillness, the world seemed to soften around us. The slow-burn tension, the hesitation, the quiet curiosity, all of it had led to this moment, a relationship built on trust, tenderness, and the patient unfolding of something rare and genuine. And in that gentle, unspoken way, I knew that this was just the beginning of a love both subtle and profound, a connection that would continue to deepen in its own beautiful, deliberate rhythm. As our story unfolds, you've seen the slow burn of connection, the quiet tension, and the tenderness of their first moments together. If you want to experience the full journey of this age gap romance, don't forget to watch the complete story, link is in the description. Dive in, and feel every heartbeat, every glance, and every quiet moment of their unfolding love.